So we started Daf Bays in Chullin on Friday. Yesterday we did Daf Gimel, and today we'll do Daf Dalid. And there's a wonderful summary of Daf Gimel here in my Gemara. So I'm going to go through that summary before we start Daf Dalid. And the entire issue is how to learn the Mishnah. The Mishnah starts with Hakol Shochtim, which is Lechatchila. Then the Mishnah goes on and says Shchitas and Kshera, which is Mashma B'di'eved. And then the Mishnah says that there's something called Gadol Omed Al Gabav, which means that there's supervision from a person over the Shchita of a Cheret Shota V'Katan. And the Mishnah establishes that that's acceptable. So that in the case of Cheret Shota V'Katan, if there's no one supervising him, then the shechita is completely invalid. But you can have a shechita with acherim omdim al gabav, which means supervision. So we started the sugya with Rabba Bar Ula, and he understood that Hakol Shochtim is coming to include even a Tameh. And a Tameh is allowed to shecht. So the Gemara asks, well, why would we think otherwise? And the answer is because although it's a behemas chulin, there's something called tahara, meaning they took upon themselves to treat a behemas chulin as if it was kodesh, altaras hakodesh, and therefore you might think that we should go ahead and say, let's not have a tameh shecht the chulin because he might come to touch the chulin. And we say no, that the Mishnah says Hakol Shochtin L'Chatchila, even a tameh, as long as he's shechting chulin, even though he's eating chulin al taras hakodesh, nevertheless we're going to allow it L'Chatchila. When is it b'di'eved shchitas and kshera, according to Rabba Bar Ula? That's in a case of kodesh, real hegdesh, and we should really not allow him to do shchita. He might come in contact with the basar and be metame kodshim, which is an isa doraisa. But the answer is that he testifies, the shochet, who's tameh, that he absolutely had no negia and he did not touch the hegdesh. Then we get to the last part of the Mishnah, according to Rab Bar Ula, where there's acherim omdim, all of this supervision, and that's a case of behemas kodesh, where it's a carbon, and in this case, whether or not the shchita should be assumed to be kshera or not depends upon the testimony of the shochet, and if the shochet is not available for questioning, so then, had it been chulin, it would be fine. But because it's kodesh, and we don't have the testimony of the shochet, he's not available for questioning, so then it's only valid if acherim ro'amoso, if at least there are other people who witnessed and supervised the shechita and could testify that the shochet used a long knife and he never came in contact, the shochet was tameh, with the hegdish. Then we go on to Abaye. Abaye understands that the Mishnah is addressing the case of a kusi, and apparently Abaye is of the opinion that the gerus of the kusim is a valid gerus, and therefore he can shecht lechatchila. And we're going to see soon that the kusim accepted shchita and they were very careful about shchita. However, we have to add, according to Abaye, in interpreting our Mishnah, another condition, and that is achirim roamos. So we need the supervision of others because we're not sure 100% that the kusi will know exactly how to do a proper shechita. However, if let's say you don't have a Yisrael Omer al Gabav who witnesses the shechita from the beginning to the end, but rather you have Nichnosim v'yotzim, you have a Yisrael, a full-fledged Jew who intermittently comes in and out. So then the Dieved will rely on the shechita of a kusi because he's afraid that maybe the Jew will show up and will catch him if he does a bagel job of the shechita. In the cases of Chereshot v'Katan, the Mishnah continues according to Abaye, then their shechita is not acceptable at all. However, in a case where there's gadol omed al gabav, then we can allow for the shechita of a Chereshot v'Katan. Now, if we want to know why Abaye, for example, and many other Amoraim rejected Rabbi Bar Ula, they wanted to say that it's very difficult to say that we're talking about a case of shchitas, tameh, and differentiating between Chullin and kodshim. And in the case of Chullin, it's that the shomer al taras hakodesh. All that was a little bit far-fetched. Then we get to Rava. Rava agrees with Abaye that we're talking about a kusi. However, Rava holds that you don't need, in order to allow the kusi to shech lechatchila, that the acherim romo, so they see the shechita, they witness the shechita from beginning to end. It's enough that they come in intermittently, meaning they yotzim v'nichnasim, and that's enough to be matir shchitas kusi lechatchila, according to Rava. Then Rava holds that if there was no Jew there at the time of the shechita kusi, then what we have to do is we have to cut off a piece of meat from the shechita, give it to the kusi, and see if he eats it. If he eats it, then that's proof positive that the shechita was reliable, because as we said before, the kusim are very careful about shechita. And then the end of the Mishnah again goes back to Chereshot v'Katan and allows the shechita only if there are others supervising the shechita. Now, again, let's emphasize that according to Abaye, the fact that the Jew comes in and out, that's not enough, because since the kusi is actually holding the animal and shechting it, then we're not sure whether or not he did a proper shechita. Then we get to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi holds that we're talking about a mumar, and the mumar eats nevela, but only because he doesn't have access to kosher food. If he had access to kosher food, then he is careful to eat the kosher food. So when do we allow this mumar to shech lechatchila? Only when we give him a knife that we've already checked out before we gave it to him. Because if we don't check out the knife, then it's going to be a hassle for him to get another knife to replace in case there's a nick in the knife. And he's too lazy to do such a thing. He eats non-kosher food anyway. Now, what happens in a b'diavad situation where we didn't give him a knife that we checked before the shechita, but after he finished the shechita, we checked out the knife? And that's a case of b'diavad. And then once again, Rav Ashi is going to learn the Mishnah, and the Sefer of the Mishnah is referring to a chereshot v'katan, and you have to have acherim omdim al gabav. Now, it could be that Rav Ashi would get involved with Rava and Abaye, who rejected his pshat, with a difficulty, or at least Abaye, I'm not sure about Rava, and that is that if he's a mumar, we're not going to allow him to shecht an animal. Even though, again, if all things were equal, he'd eat kosher meat. But since he already eats non-kosher meat, then Abaye would hold we can't rely on his shechita. So even though you handed him a knife, but that's not reliable. Then we get to Ravina. Now there were two Lashonos in Ravina. According to the first Lishna, Lechatchila kol shochtim means if we have every reason to assume that they know how to do shechita, they're skilled in shechita, even though we've never actually seen them do shechita, so they haven't established themselves with a chazaka, but nevertheless, lechatchila, we're going to allow them to do shechita because we assume that anyone who does shechita would probably be proficient in shechita. However, Ravina says that you have to add another condition, and that is that they know the laws. Forget about whether they're proficient in the Maisa Shechita, but what about the knowledge of the laws, and they know what's possible in Shechita? So for that, we have to test them. If we test them, and therefore they pass the test and they prove that they know the laws of Shechita, then L'chatchila, we can rely on the fact that they're proficient in skilled in implementing the Maisa Shechita. Now, b'di'eved, if let's say we didn't test them to see that they know the laws of Shechita, then we can test them b'di'eved after the Shechita, and we can rely on that Shechita. What happens in a case, says Ravina, where we couldn't test them before the Shechita, and even after the Shechita, we can't find them, they're nowhere to be found, and we can't test them. So, according to Ravina, that's the case in which the Shechita will be possible b'di'eved, unless there were acherim omdim al gabav. And all the other Amoroim reject Ravina for the very simple reason because they hold that a person who goes ahead and does Shechita probably is proficient not only in the skills of the Maisa Shechita, but also in the laws of Shechita. Then the Gemara quotes a second version of Ravina, and he says, L'chatchila, we need that they have a chazaka, and 3 times in the past, this person who shechts the animal has proven that he shechted properly, and then he's established himself through a chazaka that he has the skills. We have no idea if he knows the laws of shechita, but since we assume that probably he knows the laws of shechita because on 3 occasions he shechted properly, he's muchzak, and therefore l'chatchila he can shecht. But we have to add another possible fear over here, and that is maybe they fainted in the middle of the shechita. Most people, skirmish at the sight of blood, so they have to testify that they did not faint during the shechita. But if they're not around to testify, then the shechita can only be valid if there are acherim omdim al gab. Okay, now we're going to start today's daf, which is Tanu Rabbanon. Let's see where we can find that. 3 lines up before the end of Gimel Amid Beis. Tanu Rabbanon, shchitas kusi muteres. When can we rely on the shechita of a kusi? Kishi Yisrael omen al gavav. So we see that this brisa maintains that you can only allow the kusi to shecht an animal if we have Jewish people who are supervising their shechita. If the Jew comes along and it's post facto, the kusi has already shechted the animal, then the only way we could salvage this and assume that the kusi did the proper shechita is only if we can testify that the kusi himself ate from his shechita, is chote kezayis minosein lo, aval mutar lecho mishchitasa. Ochlo, I'm sorry. If he eats from his own shechita, then the kusi is reliable and will eat and declare it kosher. Vim lav, but if he is not available for eating, then also lechol mishchitasa. Kayotze bo, a similar case, matzah biyodo. What did we find the kusi holding in his hands? We're now on the top of Daf Daled. The kuria shel tziporin, shechita doesn't require metal, even a reed or something else could be caught. But kuria shel tziporim is a different issue. There, the issue is that he has many, many birds that are attached to some sort of a string. And now we don't know that his shechita was valid in each of the birds that are on the string. So what do we have to do? Kotea roshel echabe v'nosein lo. And im ochlo mi mutar v'shchitasa, im lav asa lechol mishchitasa. So it would seem that once we can establish that out of the entire string of birds, he ate one of them, then in all likelihood, his shechita was valid for all of the birds. So now we want to explain, based on this brisa, what is the machlokus between Abaye v'Rava? Remember, we had a machlokus Abaye v'Rava about a case where the kusi shechted. We weren't there to supervise the shechita from beginning to the end, but we were yotze v'nichnas. We went in occasionally to go in and out, and Rava said that was fine. So the Gemara says the following. Abaye diek miresha and Rava diek misefa. Abaye diek miresha. The resha of this brisa says the following. Time of Yisrael omen al gavav. That the reason why the shechita of a kusi is l'chadchila acceptable is because we were supervising him from beginning to end. Aval yotze v'nichnas, if only we go in and out, then lo, because we say that maybe the kusi, when we went out, he did something to boggle the shechita. But Rava diek mi seifa. What does it say in the seifa? It says in the seifa, taima deba umitzo sheshachat, that we need to test the kusi to see if he'll eat the meat. And that's because the Jew came after the shechita was complete. So from the beginning of the shechita till the end of the shechita, there was no Jew available anywhere in sight. Aval, the implication is, says Rava, yotze v'nichnas, if there was a Jew who came in and out, even though he didn't see the entire shechita from beginning to end, then shaper dami, that would be okay, and we could eat from the shechita. So now the Gemara is going to say, well, if Abaye was medaik from the Reisha, then Rava is going to have to justify the Reisha. If Rava was medaik from the Seifa, then Abaye has to justify the Seifa. So the Gemara says the following: Ula Abaye kashya Seifa. How is Abaye can understand the Seifa, where the problem is that the Jew came after the shechita was complete, implying that Yotze v'nichnas would have been sufficient. Yotze v'nichnas nami ba umitzo karile. Even though the brisa uses the language of mitzao, but that's because the brisa is using a halachic description, not a physical mitzius, a reality description, and included in the case of the Seifa, which is matzo ba'umitzo, is a case of yotze v'nichnas. Yotze v'nichnas is equivalent to ba'umitzo. Ula Rava kasha reisha, That again, even though the Brisa utilizes the terms of Omer al Gabav, those terms are describing not the reality, the Mitzias, but rather the concept. And the reality was it was even Yotze v'Nichnas. And Yotze v'Nichnas is equivalent to Omed al Gabav, meaning where they supervise the Shechita from beginning to the end. Then the Brisa says the following: Kayotze bo mitzo biyodu dekuria shel tziporin kotea rosho amai lechush dilma hayu davi shochit shapir. Maybe when the kusi eats one of the birds from this entire string, that was the one that was a perfectly valid shechita, but the others were not shechted properly, and that's why the kusi wouldn't eat the other birds. So you'd have to test them with each one of the birds individually. Amar Menashe. What the Jew did is he took the birds and he put them under his garment. Then he cuts off the head of one of them. The kusi has no way of knowing which of the birds he was cutting off. So therefore, if he eats them, that is proof positive that all of them were kosher. How do you know that the fact that the Yisrael hid the bird, that means that the kusi who shechted the bird has no way of identifying one bird and differentiating it from the others, right? How would you know such a thing? Maybe he has a simon. Maybe he knows how to identify that bird. It's got a blue strip, strip under its nose. I don't know. What the Jew has to do is has to make it totally obliterate it, like crush its head in such a way that there's no way he can have any identifying mark. How do you know that the kusim that you claim are reliable to do shchita are reliable even to shecht ofos, that now we can eat from his oaf? After all, the shchita of an oaf doesn't appear in the Torah. The kusim are bound to the written scripture of the Torah, where it's talking about zevach behema, no mention of birds. So maybe he doesn't hold from the whole Iser Nevela in birds. Torah never required shechita in birds. So Gemara says, "L'taimech shehia drasach haloda agroma v'ikar mik sivan." You're going to tell me that we can rely on the kusi because his gerus and they're makbid on shechita. But now you're telling me, no, maybe we can't rely on them unless we know that they accepted shechita in ofos. Even in behema, how do you know to rely on them? You're going to tell me that shechita is min Torah and they accepted it? Yeah, but what about all the psulei shechita? There are 5 categories of psulei shechita. None of them are written in the Torah. So to the same extent, the kusi doesn't accept shechita of ofos, maybe he doesn't accept all the psulim of shechita. Ella, but we always have to answer with the following answer, and that is Kevadach Zikabahu. We've seen the kusi and all the kusim have proven themselves to be very careful about shechita, and therefore they would never passel shechita with any of the 5 categories of psulei shechita. Is hachinami Kevadach chesku chesku. Here too, also they've established themselves to be shochtim on ofos. So that proves that they are very careful about shechita and ofos, and we can rely on them. So the Gemara now asks the following: you're telling me that the kusim are reliable even on that which is not in the Torah. V'achsuk v'lo ichsuk b'lo ksiva. Are you going to tell me that in anything that's not written in the Torah, they have to prove themselves in order to establish their reliability? And the Gemara says, you know what? Tanoihi. And now we're going to learn a 3-way machlokas tanoim, which we're going to try to interpret. Tisanya, we learned in the Brisa. Now we're up to the Tanakama. Matzas kusi muteres. The Torah says to be careful about chametz, And the kusim will be careful to make sure that they're eating matzah on Pesach that did not ferment, did not leaven. It's not chametz. And therefore, Adam Yotze Ba Yidei Chavas Pesach. Let's say the kusi invites you or you buy this matzah. It's like chaburas hakusim matzahs, baked in less than 18 minutes, blah, blah, blah. And you can rely on that and be Yotze on the night of Pesach, the mitzvah berev tochlu matz. That's the Tanakh. And now we get to Rabbi Eliezer, who's on the other extreme, Oser. He says we cannot rely on the kusim, no matter what. Don't tell me that they're careful about chametz, and therefore the matzah is matzah. Lefisha ein bekim v'dikduke mitzvah Yisrael. They're not careful about the nuances of halacha, the complexity of the halacha. They don't understand all the details of the halacha, especially with regards to chametz, because there are all sorts of simonim as to whether or not he left it out too long and it was chimus to simonim. They don't know that. They don't know any of that. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, basically don't rely on kusim for the mitzvah of matzah. And maybe he's going to go a step further. We can't rely on them for any mitzvah because they're not medagdek. They're not bekiyim b'dikduke mitzvahs. Now we get to the third opinion in this price. So Reb Shimon Gamliel, and it sounds like he's like the middle of the road shita. He says the following: can we rely on the kusim? Kol mitzvah shehechziku, but if they've proven to us in the past they have a track record and they've established that they fulfill the mitzvah the way the Torah gives it, is then harbe medagdikim ba Yosef Yisrael. They're even more careful about that which they accept than a Jew. Okay, so now we want to go through these three shitas of Tanoim and figure out exactly what the machlokus is. Omar Ma. Excuse me. So we have the Tanakama, matzahs kusi muteres, Gemara says pshita. If you're telling me that their matzah is not chametz, why do you have to tell me that I could use it for the leil matzah of Leila Pesach for the mitzvah? With regard to the matzah that we eat on the night of Pesach, the Torah says ushmartem es hamatzos, and you need shmira. In fact, one sheet is that you need shmira from Shas Ktsira. They don't know anything about that. Kamashma the Raisa therefore tells us, you know what? Their matzah, like Chabura matzahs of Kusim, a new company, right? Their matzah is reliable. You can eat it on the night of Pesach for the sake of the mitzvah al mitzvahs matzah, because they're makpid even on shmira to make it into shmira matzah shmura. Then we have Rabbi Eliezer also fishaim bekim mitzvahs, and the Gemara says explains that maybe what it means is that kasavar lo beki b'shimur. What it means is, and again, the word shimur here doesn't mean ushmartem es hamatzos, but rather shimur michametz, to make sure that it's not chametz, and they're not reliable. There's so many dikduke mitzvahs here, they don't know anything about it. And now we have the third shita, which I claimed was the compromise view, the middle of the road view. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer mitzvah shech ziku ba kusim harbe kusim is harbe medagdekin ba Yosem Yisrael. So now the Gemara wants to know. Let's compare the Tanakama, who says you could rely on the matzahs kusim and even eat it for the first night of Pesach for mitzvah shmira, and Reb Shimon Gamliel, who says that Hichziku bakusim, we can rely on them. And they're even more medagdik than we are. Hainu Tanakama. So more answers Ikabeinayu, and the Gemara is going to change its mind here. But in the Havamina, the Gemara thinks that Ikabeinayu Ksiva Veloach Zikuba, what happens with that which is written in the Torah, in Scripture, which we should assume that the Kusim would accept, but loch zikube, we've never seen them, they've never proven themselves, they have no track record. Is Tanakama sover, came with ksiva, if it's in the Torah explicitly, afal gav de loch zikuba, we don't have to see and have their track record to prove them. They follow the Torah shebechsav. Again, they don't rely on the Chachamim and the interpretation of Torah Shebaal Peh, but they rely on Torah Shebechsa. And therefore, we don't need Achziku Beh. But Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer, Achziku in, Lo Achziku lo. We're not going to rely on the fact that, well, they are careful and they accepted the Torah Shebechsa. What are you talking about? There's so many dikduke mitzvahs here in the mitzvah of matzah, and to make sure and guarantee that it's not chametz, I can't rely on them, even that which is explicit in the Torah. The Gemara is going to reject this. If this be the case, that according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, we don't rely on kusim, is then why does Rav Shimon Gamliel go ahead and say kol mitzvah shechziku bakusim is they're more makpid than we are? Im echziku mi boile. Now the words mi boile are a little bit complicated, sort of, because they mean different things in different Gemaras. But here, mi boile means it should have said, or he should have formulated it in the following way. He should have said im echziku mi boile. Im echziku, not kol mitzvah shehechziku bo, but im echziku, meaning that Rav Shimon Gamliel does not accept the fact that this mitzvah is written in the Torah. That doesn't give us any guarantee that the kusim are careful about it. But im echziku, if they went ahead and on various occasions they established themselves as being reliable, then we can rely on them. And therefore, Ella, the Gemara comes up with a new twist on the machlokes of Shimon Gamliel and Tanna Kama. Ikiminai delo ksiva v'achziku ba. Here, Reb Shimon Gamliel is going to be mekil in this interpretation. The Tanna Kama is going to say, well, you're talking about something that's not in the Torah. They only accepted that which is written in the written Torah. And therefore, Tanna Kama Sover came to ksiva afagav l'achziku ba nami lo. Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer came to achziku achzik, that we can rely on their chazaka. They have a record 3 times in the past. They've proven themselves. We're going to rely on them, even on something that's not written in the Torah. Gufa Marava Yisrael Bumarachol Nefel Suteyoman Bodek Sakin Vinoselo. Rava was the one who said that even though he's a mumar, but nevertheless he's only a mumar l'teyavon. He's not lahachis. He doesn't deliberately try. L'teyavon, he's out there and they offer him a treifa sandwich, and right now he has no access to kosher food, so he'll eat the treif. Is in such a case, says Rava, he's not going to create an avela by shechting him properly, and we could check out the knife, make sure everything's fine, give him the knife, and let him go shech. Mutalecha mishchutos. My timer, teva deika tera v'isura, lo shavik tera v'yochel isura. If he has a choice in front of him between kosher meat, non-kosher meat, he'll eat the kosher meat. And therefore, in this case, says Rava, if we guarantee that the sakin is a reliable kosher sakin for shechita, give him the sakin, let him shecht, and everything is fine. And why is that? Because lo shavik hetera v'yachal isur. So why did you have to check out the knife? Why not say, well, he'll do a proper shechita, and so the Gemara answers mitzvah lo tarach, because as we said earlier, if it turns out there's a nick on the knife, and now he has to find a different knife and replace it, that tircha he's not going to go through. He's not willing to expend himself that far because he eats non-kosher food. Amalei Rabbanu Rava Tanya the Messiah. We want to bring a raya to support you that a mumar who's only l'teyavon is reliable. And the Brisa says, Chemtzon shall over avera achar pesach muter miyat. Well, this is a whole story over here. I remember my youth. We used to, after Pesach, and we wanted all our cereals, we were addicted to cereals. So the first thing we want to do after Pesach is buy the cereals. So we would go to A&P. That was a chain store in the New York area, which was owned by Goy. We knew it was owned by Goy. Wallbaum's was a question mark. So we didn't. Now, what's going on over here? You want to eat the chametz of kusim. Now, if the kusim held on to their chametz during Pesach, which is a violation of lo yirah, lo yimotzeh, then you're not allowed to get benefit from that chametz. But what happens over here? The kusim do a swap with goyim. They take their chametz and they swap it with that of the goyim. And therefore, we could eat their chametz after Pesach because we could believe and rely on the fact that this chametz was not owned by the kusi, but rather was owned by a goy.